Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians have slightly expanded their positions northwest of Vuhledar, gaining a foothold in the next forest line. And on top of this, they are also launching an additional assault to the northeast of Vuhledar in the direction of Territorial. The Russians are here expanding their offensive operations to continue on the northern side of the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar. This points towards the Russians not being interested in storming the town itself head on like they have done before, but simply to continue around it, attacking the Ukrainian towns and villages on the northern side and western side of Vuhledar, completely ignoring the town itself, cutting off its supplies and forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw from it. Because at the current rate, if the Ukrainians do not withdraw from Vuhledar, they will be surrounded by the Russians by cutting off all of the roads and gaining control over the villages and towns around the town itself of Vuhledar. This means that the Russians will, if time permits and the Ukrainians refuse to withdraw, to capture Novoukrayinka, Bohovyalenka, and continuing along the western parts of Konstantinivka, as the Ukrainians simply sit there and starve out. Further north here in the direction of Maximilianivka, the Russians have made a small advance, which is followed by the Russian capture of Hostre just north of Maximilianivka. The Russian objective here is to gain full control of Maximilianivka, to reach the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near Kurakhove, and to remove the Ukrainian position here to the direction south of Hostre, allowing the Russians to connect their position between Hostre and Maximilianivka and cut off the road between the pocket here to the north and Kurakhove. This is in connection with the Russian offensive operations to the north in the direction of Ukrainsk, Selydove, and so on. In the Ukrainsk direction, there's something I didn't mention in my previous analysis, and that is that the Russians now will be focusing on flanking Selydove from the south. The Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation by sending additional reinforcements to Selydove, where they have succeeded in urban fighting to push the Russians out of the central parts of the town and out to the northern and eastern outskirts. The Russians are now moving to the open fields to the south, cutting off the supplies between Selydove and Hirnik at the same time as they push to the southern flank of Selydove. This will force the Ukrainians to withdraw to the western parts of the city, limiting the amount of troops they can push into Selydove and allow the Russians to concentrate their fire on a smaller area. Currently, the positions in Selydove are in favor of the Ukrainians in the southern outskirts, where they've managed to gain full control over the southern part of the town, while in the northern parts it is at an even rate due to the Russians having control over the high ground and the Ukrainians having a much wider area under their control, though both have some advantages and disadvantages. All in all, the situation in Selydove is very dynamic, as the Ukrainians have a lot of units there, which means that they are capable of launching offensive and defensive operations successfully, while the Russians have a lot of firepower to make use of, and they are flanking the town itself from the northern and southern flank. In the Chasiv Yar section of the front line, the Russians are attacking further here to the southwest of Ivanyivsk, gaining full control over the eastern bank of the canal, and with their foothold on the western bank across the canal line, we see that the Russians are currently working on two forest areas where they are attempting a crossing over to the western bank, and they are slowly securing the entire eastern bank. The final parts here to the northwest of Klishivka will likely fall under Russian control, or is likely actually already under Russian control, while the southern parts will be the next target to gain full control over the eastern bank of the canal. Meanwhile, on the northern flank, the battle over Ryhorivka continues as Russians expand their zone of control on the eastern bank of the canal, and they continue to expand their foothold on the western bank of it. The Battle of Chasiv Yar is still in its initial phases, where the Russians are here trying to take advantage of the Ukrainian soldiers being spread out across the entire section of the front line to advance bit by bit and expand their zone of control. In the Kupiansk section of the front line, we see that the Russians have expanded both to the north of Pishane and to the south of Sinkivka. The Russians are slowly doing positional fighting in the direction of Kupiansk, taking advantage of yet again the Ukrainian relocation of troops, spreading out their forces thinly across the entirety of the front line, and the Russians take advantage of their superior firepower and manpower to slowly advance across the front line. If you notice a significant change, it is that usually when explaining Russian advances, it is simply the Russian firepower advantage. Now it is the Russian firepower and manpower advantage, and this is why the Russians are able to advance much faster than they used to, especially considering that if we take a look at my recap map, which is only for Patreon and YouTube members, we see that the Ukrainians had a large success in the Kursk region where they managed to capture 827 square kilometers of territory. But if the Russians in the month of August and September is compared with the Ukrainian advances in the month of August and September where the Kursk offensive took place, the Russians actually come out on top in the amount of square kilometers captured, and this is mainly due to the success so far of the Russian counteroffensive in the Kursk region, which has managed to recapture about 220 square kilometers in just 4 days. And in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, where in the previous month the Russians managed to capture 250 square kilometers in this single area of the front line, 61 square kilometers in the New York and Toretsk section of the front line, and several other advances like 44 square kilometers in the Vuhledar section. So we see that the Russians have made several advances across the front line over the past 2 months, both this one and the last one, which has allowed the Russians to have a net increase. In the Kursk section of the front line, the Russian offensive operations continue, where the main fighting is taking place in the direction of Lyubimovka, but also in the surrounding villages in the line of defense that the Ukrainians have. The initial success of the Russians is mainly due to the forward positions of the Ukrainians were not that stable, and the Russians caught them off guard, leading to several villages being captured very quickly. And the Russians capitalized on that success to continue with the capture of Snagost and onwards towards Pokrovsky, all the way to gaining a foothold in Lyubimovka from the southern flank. At the same time, it is reported that the Ukrainians are strengthening the offensive operations in the north towards Kurakhove. The operation here is to cut off the connection, and then at the same time they are fighting in the direction of Selydove towards Kurakhove, where the objective of the Ukrainians is not just to stop the Russian offensive, but also to completely encircle it by capturing Kurakhove to the northeast, Kurakhove to the west, and having the River Same to the north, which would leave the Russians completely encircled in this pocket. However, so far over a period of 2 to 3 days, the Ukrainians have only managed to capture this border village of Novye Put, which is just across the border. Fighting took place in Uburovka and Veselove, where some reports suggested that the Ukrainians actually managed to gain a foothold. Others suggested that the Ukrainians managed to capture the village, but it is reported so far that this is not the case. According to my sources, the Ukrainians have only made this small foothold across the border, and heavy fighting is taking place in the direction of Veselove and Uburovka. The significant part of this section of the front line is that there is only this initial part between the Ukrainian border and Kurakhove. However, the Russians do have a defensive line here to the south of Kurakhove, which they can use to defend the railways and will allow the Russians to continue to supply here to the east, which is more dense of a territory compared here to the west. This means that the Ukrainians still have the main battle ahead of them if they capture Veselove and Uburovka, but just having the fighting this close to Kurakhove could slow down or disrupt the Russian Kursk counteroffensive. So we are yet to see the peak of the fighting, but according to reports, it suggests that the Ukrainians are currently putting everything they have towards the current situation at the front line, because we are currently seeing multiple extremely important battles taking place. The most important battle in the south is the battle over Pokrovsk, which is the beating heart of the Donetsk region, while the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line is the bronze and muscles of the Ukrainian defenses in the Donetsk region. Pokrovsk is the beating heart that allows it to function. In the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, there's no significant developments, but heavy artillery continues every single day throughout this conflict. The same in the Kherson region. In the eastern parts of Donetsk, the battle over Chasiv Yar, a very important stronghold that overlooks the entire Kramatorsk-Konstantinivka line here in the east. The Russians have a foothold in central parts of Toretsk and have full control over New York. In the north, the Battle of Kupiansk continues, which is again a very important logistical hub for the Ukrainians in the eastern bank of the Kursk River line, and will allow the Russians to push along the Kursk River line down in the southern direction and expand the zone of control in the north, freeing up troops to fight further south along the Kursk River line and gain control over the northern parts of the Donetsk region and threaten the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the north. At the same time, the Ukrainians have diverted a lot of their forces in the Kharkiv direction to prevent a Russian breakthrough there, and in the Kursk direction, the Ukrainians bet it all on an offensive, which seems to have completely failed, and the Russians are launching a counteroffensive to hurt the Ukrainians as much as possible during their bet, and the Ukrainians are doubling down with their own offensive to counter the Russian counteroffensive. And this ends up with the Ukrainians committing as many forces as they have available to the front line. And this just means that the current battles, whoever comes out on top can take a significant advantage of the situation. But all of this can be disrupted by a simple natural fact, and that is the weather. If the weather turns bad and everything turns muddy, then the Russian offensive can end. So I believe the Ukrainians are here betting on the weather coming in to save them, to stop the Russian offensive, to slow it down at the very least, and to give the Ukrainians some break to build up forces yet again. Unfortunately for Ukraine, I have some bad news, and those bad news: global warming. As we can see, it is completely sun, no rain. Completely sun, no rain. Sun, no rain. And the temperature is generally above the 20s during the daytime and above somewhere around 5 to 10 during the nighttime. And the situation is generally that the weather will continue as is, and simply the Russian offensive will continue. The Russians will be able to use the fields, to be able to use everything completely as normal. When the weather changes and rain starts appearing, it will take a couple of weeks before the ground really turns muddy, and even at that point some roads can still be used, some off-road roads can still be used. So in the end, the Russian offensive is not expected to end anytime soon, at least within the next couple of weeks. 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks, the Russian offensive will continue, and the Ukrainian situation right now is extremely difficult. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.